Last week I posted a video showing you some rare and ancient varieties of corn. I love learning about ancient cultures and native people and the type of crops they grew and survived on. Last year in my garden, I focused on growing heirloom varieties of foods that were cultivated by Native Americans prior to European contact. They had a huge diversity of crops they grew, everything from devil's claw, cotton, peppers, amaranth, panic grass, corns, beans, squash, and more. And amongst those crops, there's a huge diversity. There's over 1,000 different varieties of corn, same with beans, many different varieties of squash. And it's fun to find these seeds and grow heirloom varieties. Some of them are thousands of years old. Now, a common agriculture practice that Native Americans did was to grow a Three Sisters garden, which consisted of corns, beans, and squash. I've already showed you some of the corns that I like to grow, so in this video I will focus on different heirloom beans. These are really fun, easy to grow, and healthy. So I'll go through all of these individually and really give you some suggestions on what heirloom varieties of beans that you might want to grow in your garden. There's many different varieties of beans and several species. For example, lima beans are a different species than tepary beans, and there's a huge diversity of these common beans. And amongst these different groups, there's different ways that they grow. There's bush beans, pole beans, snap beans. I'll go through these and give you some suggestions on my favorite beans that I like to grow. I'll start with lima beans. These are called Hopi gray lima beans. Originally, when you take them out of the shell, they're a gray color, and as they dry, they turn a light brown. They can be one solid light color, or mottled, or almost black. They have a great flavor. I got these from the Native Seed Search Seed Bank, which is where I get most of my native seeds. They come from the desert southwest, so these crops grow really well with little irrigation. And the Native Seed Search is really working on preserving ancient and heirloom varieties of seeds. So when you're wondering where I get most of them, it's from Native Seed Search. My all-time favorite heirloom variety of lima beans are these. They're called calico because of the white and maroon mottling color. They're also sometimes called Christmas or chestnut lima beans because they have a slight nutty flavor. When you cook them, they hold that maroon color, and they are really good. They're a very early and prolific producer in the garden. They were originally collected in Wild Horse, Colorado. Here's what a dry pod of the Calcutta Lima-Bean looks like. Usually there's only one or two, sometimes three in there, but they're really big and they're very prolific, so it's hard to keep up picking all of these in time. It's definitely a great choice. Next, we'll look at a few varieties of runner beans, which mean these plants are going to put out a huge long vine that's going to want to climb. These are called Scarlet runner beans, and they're some of the biggest beans that I grow. They're black and purple in color, and they produce these huge pods, so you're going to get a ton of food by growing these. You just pop that open, and you'll see all those beans growing inside. Now, these are great for the garden, not only because they produce so much food, but their red flowers attract a lot of pollinators. I see hummingbirds, native bees, and a variety of pollinators coming to get these flowers, and that's great for your garden. And it's really nice to see a thick wall of vines with red flowers everywhere and these huge pods hanging down. Here's another really good choice for an heirloom runner bean. These beans are huge. They're called Aztec or mortgage lifter beans, and again, they'll have a pod that has one or two in there, and it's just a great way to harvest this food. I didn't grow too many of these in my garden last year due to space, but even though I only had a few plants, I still harvested several pounds of these beans. Very, very prolific. Here we have a whole different species of bean than the common bean or lima bean. These are called tepary beans. They're smaller in size and adapted for the dry desert conditions. They've been grown by people living in the desert southwest for thousands of years. Here we have some tiny beans. These are the wild ancestors or natural progenitors of these tepary beans. These were found growing wild in the Rock Corral Canyon. It's an area where there's a lot of wild ancestors growing of our food crops. Devil's claw, squash, cotton, and these tepary beans. Now, these tiny beans were developed generation after generation by selective breeding and developed into different varieties. We have white, brown, black. The white ones are said to have a slightly sweet flavor, and the brown more an earthy flavor. Now, these are incredibly healthy to eat, and they're a very dense bean. They take a long time to cook. I'll hear people say they put them on the pot in the morning, and by the afternoon, they're ready to eat. Now, these are high in protein and soluble fiber and have been proven to fight some of the effects of high cholesterol and diabetes, so they're very healthy and a very ancient food. This is my favorite common pole bean. It's a black bean called Cherokee Trail of Tears. It was reported to have been carried from Tennessee to Oklahoma by the Cherokee people who were marched by the federal government in 1839 on that infamous march where many of them suffered and died. And it's a really great bean. It grows well with corn. It loves to climb up corn and sunflowers, and it produces a lot of beans. Now, I grew this for several years, and last year I noticed one of the plants started growing these funny brown beans. I don't know if that was a crossbreed or just a mutation, if anybody knows why suddenly my black beans are turning brown. but it's interesting to see how they change from generation to generation. Definitely a highly recommended bean, the Cherokee Trail of Tears pole bean. Up to now, I've mostly talked about eating the beans as a dry bean. Well, this is my favorite green bean. This is called a Hopi purple string bean, and it's really fun to go out in the garden and pick these as a green pod and just munch on them. It's a real treat. This bean has an interesting story. It's called a cave bean or an Anasazi bean, and it was reported to have been found in a clay pot, and the seeds were several thousand years old, and they still grew. I don't know if that story is true or not. There's been lots of stories like that for pumpkins, tobacco, watermelons. It seems to be a common story. It might be true, might not, but this may be a 1,000-year-old variety of beans. It's great to grow, and it grows as a vine, makes these big long pods, and a heavy producer. You just pop those open, and you got a ton of beans in there. Again, it has a really good flavor, and it just loves to climb and grow all over the fence, sunflowers, corn, wherever it can. When looking at these heirloom varieties of beans and corn, I noticed that the seeds are really colorful. Sometimes I think that when they select generation after generation for seeds, they not only pick things for flavor and for size of plant, but also for the color of the seeds. This is a really colorful one called Black Nightfall. It's a very rare heirloom variety of beans. Last year someone gifted me just 5 seeds. I grew out as many as I could and got a pretty good harvest, and this year I'm trying to increase my seed supply. I love getting rare and heirloom varieties of seeds from people, and a Black Nightfall is one of my favorite just by the color of it. Just speckly, it's kind of a gray with black, and I can see why it's called Black Nightfall. Hopefully next year I'll have a large supply and I can start sharing these. When I first became interested in growing heirloom varieties of food, this is the first bean I tried. It's called a yellow Araucaria bean, sometimes called the Lewis and Clark bean. It was reported to have been eaten by the Lewis and Clark expedition as they spent the winter with native people in the Dakota Territory. And they liked it so much that they brought seeds back to Thomas Jefferson, and it reported that he grew those in Monticello. It's a bush bean and a high producer, and it yields early. I'll plant these the same time as some of the vining and pole beans, and we'll harvest these over a month early. And I have built up a huge seed supply. Originally that first year I had a seed pack with 20, and now I have thousands and thousands of seeds, and I enjoy eating them. They put on this big long pod, and if you don't harvest it in time, they actually will break free and just fling seeds everywhere. So you have to pick these just before they completely dry out, because that pod has a natural seed dispersion method where it just flings them out. Now these have such a good flavor, and pretty soon is going to be Independence Day here in America, the 4th of July, and my wife is going to cook these into baked beans. So stay tuned, because you'll see a baked bean recipe with these heirloom varieties of beans that I grew in the garden. Now if you're looking for an economical way to get a huge selection of heirloom beans, some of the varieties that I wanted weren't available at Native Seed Search because their supplies were too low, but I noticed under their food section they were selling this. This is called Tom's Mix, and it's advertised as having 14 heirloom bean varieties. It's usually in a pound bag for $12, and it had a lot of the varieties that I wanted but weren't available. So I bought it and planted, and they all grew great. It's being sold as a food for cooking beans, but it actually works great for planting in your garden, and you get a huge selection. It's really fun too to separate them out and look them up, Google each different variety and see which ones are which. These are the varieties they include. It's a huge list, and a lot of the ones that I featured you can get right in here for $12. You can get 14 different varieties. I don't know how many he has in supply if you'll be able to find this, but just Google Tom's Mix 14 heirloom bean varieties, and you can get a huge jump start on your heirloom bean collection. So stay tuned. I got a lot more gardening videos. I've showed you the varieties, and in future videos I'll show you how I actually grow these. I do a lot of Three Sisters gardens where they're growing up corn, and I especially like growing them up sunflowers. So I'll show you that in a future video, and send your comments. I love hearing comments, especially about these heirloom varieties. Thanks.